All right, let's just start this debate with a little bit of context. In this year alone, in the US, there have been 1,943 deaths from gun violence. There have been 32 mass shootings, as defined, where there have been 4 or more injured parties or killed. And in Australia, in 2015, in the entirety of the year, there were only 211 deaths. And the last time that we had a mass shooting was in 2014, where only 3 people died. Now, even if you adjust these per capita, that comes out to 0.00006, like 0.000006 US deaths versus our 0.00009 deaths. So you're 3 points behind us in the space of 1.5 months in a stat that takes us the entire year. Clearly, the US experiment as it pertains to gun control has failed, and now it is time for you to adopt a more sensible policy like one that has been placed by the US. So let's just outline what we're going to be doing. The first thing is that we're going to need to get rid of the Second Amendment, because obviously there are going to be some infringements on the right to keep and bear arms. There are a lot of things that go into Australia's gun policy, but I'll run over what I think are kind of the key ones. First thing is to note that automatic and semi-automatic weapons are banned, that all guns must be registered to the government so they're able to be tracked, that in order to own a gun, you must have and keep it on your property, you must have a valid reason for that ownership, i.e. you need it for hunting or you need it for farming. If you want to own a gun outside of those reasons just for recreational shooting, you still can, but it must be kept in a gun club or in a shooting range where you then go to shoot. That it must be stored appropriately and locked up, with ammo and guns being stored separately. And this is the most key point, I think, that after the institution of this policy, there is an extensive buyback offer where people can sell their guns back to the government to recuperate their financial gain. And then even after that period, if people choose to keep onto their guns illegally, there are regular amnesty periods where they can still engage in that buyback at no question, and they're not going to get in trouble. This is all important because I think that the only way that we're going to get the effects is to actually decrease the number of guns that are in circulation, because that's how we're going to get the best outcomes. Why do we need all of this to happen? Is because guns are not instruments of safety that can be used to protect you and your family. They inherently escalate the situation to a more dangerous situation and are not effective for their primary purpose. They're still useful in cases where people need them for hunting and farming, and the law makes allowances for all those sort of things. But by doing so, by taking these actions and removing guns, the effects that we will see are going to be less deaths. We're going to see less suicides, which I'll explain a bit later. People are going to be more safe in their homes and communities, and we're going to get better engagement from policing. Those are my opening statements. I'll pass it over to you.
Okay. So the first thing that I want to say here is that while I would agree with you that there are some things that Australia is doing that are successful, the overall point is that Australia is not applicable to the United States for a couple of reasons. Number one, Australia is an island, so it is harder to smuggle guns to the island of Australia than it would be to get guns into the United States. So even if we banned guns in the United States, it's very different than if they were banned in Australia. And number two, America is positioned next to Mexico and Central America, which are some of the highest crime-rated countries in the world. Even if we banned guns in the United States, that won't work because there are neighbors nearby who can smuggle guns in. Even according to the current system, there are an estimated 250,000 guns that are brought into the United States each year. So even if we were to ban guns legally in the United States, that doesn't change anything. Next, even in Australia, while the gun violence rate went down, at first, homicides, total homicides, after the gun policy was put in place, homicides went up for the first several years. And since then, restabilized and started going back down again, but they're only in line with where they were before the regulations were put in place. So the gun regulations that you guys put in place didn't actually change anything. All they did was initially put homicides up a little bit, and then they stabilized back to the norm. But we can't say that the gun regulations actually changed anything. The same is true in the United Kingdom, which banned guns and experienced a temporary increase in homicides and then stabilized back to the norm. Now, it's interesting to point this out because the next point I'm going to make here is that the United States murder rate has also been falling at the same level during that same time period. In fact, since the 1990s, the United States has had their murder rate cut in half. So while Australia has claimed some advantages from their gun policy, the United States has the same exact thing, even though we're increasing the number of guns. So it simply is not applicable to talk about Australia in this context when the United States gets the same exact advantage. The next point I'm going to make here is going to be that the United States suffers 15,000 gun deaths per year, but has 500,000 to 3 million uses of guns in self-defense each year, according to the CDC. Now, you stated that guns are not instruments of safety. However, that is disproven by the evidence, which says that far more often than not in the United States, guns are being used for self-defense. The last point I'm going to make here is going to be that if the United States tried to buy back or legally enforce a ban on guns, the amount of civil revolt that would be faced would be huge. So this argument is going to literally come down to civil war. In the United States, to ban to get a third to a fifth of guns away, which is what Australia did, that would be 60 million to 105 million American guns. Anyone who has met American gun owners will recognize that they are going to be incredibly incensed at this. They will literally revolt. This will significantly increase the amount of lives lost. So it's much better to stick with status quo where it's better.
All right, a couple of responses to your cases, and then I'm going to move on to some of my substantive. You're saying it's not applicable because of the huge rates of smuggling that you get in. That ignores the fact that when you have sensible, overreaching gun restrictions, it becomes much harder for people to smuggle guns into the country. Under the status quo, people are smuggling guns into their country because they can do things like forge paperwork, they can pass off illegal guns as legal guns, and they can circulate them because there's not enough checks and balances. When you have every gun that is being registered, as is the case under Australian law, it becomes much easier to track those illegal guns, and so you see a decrease in the black market. Secondly, you wanted to talk about homicides. I would doubt the validity of your statistics, and I'll refer to you. I'll post some things in the comments about statistics that I've looked. It seems that in all cases, homicides are in fact just going down. It is just true that we are getting overall safer. But homicides is only one part of this debate. We're also talking about suicides, which are 2/3 of gun deaths that occur, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and things like mass shootings, which I think massively go down for reasons that I'll explain later. You talk about the validity of use of guns for self-defense, and you say that it's very effective. There's a study that gets quoted quite often by the Violence Policy Center. It says it's far more likely if you own a gun that you are going to hurt yourself or hurt people around you or have people around you hurt themselves than it is then you're actually going to be used for self-defense. If you want to engage in self-defense, there are far more effective ways of doing it, as I'll talk about a little bit later in my speech. But on just some more substantive about why less guns are important is because if you don't put in the kind of application that actually reduces the entirety of gun ownership, then you still have people being able to obtain those guns via illegal means. A lot of the people who engage in these mass shootings do not legally own those guns. They get them from somewhere else. So when you have all the guns being registered, when you have them being locked up appropriately, it becomes much harder for people to get those guns, and you decrease the overall amount of gun ownership. Why is that important specifically for suicides, which make up a majority of gun deaths? Because suicidal episodes are the kinds of things that only last for about 20 minutes, which means that having such an effective way to kill yourself on hand is something that is massively detrimental, because in that 20-minute span, you can successfully execute a suicide plan. If you take guns away from those people, you see the rate of suicides drop massively, because now they have to try harder ways in order to be able to carry out their suicide plan, which means they are more likely to fail when they do try, or more likely to spend so much time trying to plan that they forego the 20-minute window and don't give into that suicidality. You also see a mass decrease in the number of school shootings because the kind of disgruntled and disaffected people who would normally take guns from their parents or from other people no longer have a source to be able to gain those things. And so you see a huge amount of safety there. But you also see better policing, because currently police are trained under the assumption that every assailant is possible to have a lethal gun and something that can attack them. And so they are trained to attack first and assume that rather than defend themselves. If it is the case that you take away the guns from the system, you are able to shift police training into one where they're more able to focus on de-escalation, which is more beneficial.
Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about, you said that it would be much harder to smuggle guns in, but my response would be increased incentive. There is far more incentive to smuggle guns in illegally if the United States was to have bans on certain aspects of guns. The second response here that I'm going to make is going to be that it's simply not true. Even right now where we have gun control policies, it doesn't work in terms of stopping illegal weapons. So we've already have in the current system proof that this wouldn't actually work. So there's going to be an increased amount of illegal weapons coming into the country, which means the impact of this is that more innocent civilians are going to die. Because the people who are going to have weapons are going to be the ones who shouldn't legally have weapons, whereas the ones who give back their weapons are the ones who are the good guys. So we have, and this is going to lead me back to the point about efficacy of guns. Now, you stated that it was far more likely if you have a gun that there will be violence with a gun. Well, my response would be violence, period. You're looking at guns in a vacuum, but you can't look at guns in a vacuum. You got to look at total violence. If you are being attacked, the question is, how do you respond in kind? This is why we then look at the overall numbers, and we see that there are 12,000 gun homicides, or if we include suicides, it goes up to 30,000. Okay, so we're at 30,000 total gun deaths, but 500,000 to 3 million times per year, guns are being used in self-defense. That is a net positive in the United States. There is no reason to get rid of something that is experiencing a positive for the United States. The next thing that you talked about was that you doubted the homicide stats. Well, actually, I'm going to read you from Leah Libresco of 538, the research organization, which says, quote, "My colleague and I at 538 spent 3 months analyzing all lives ended by guns each year in the United States, and I wound up frustrated in a whole new way. We looked at what interventions might have saved these people, and the case for the policies I'd lobbied for crumbled when I examined the evidence. I researched the strictly tightened gun laws in Britain and Australia and concluded that they didn't prove what America's policy should be. Neither nation experienced drops in gun-related crime that could be attributed to their buybacks and bans. In both Australia and Britain, the gun restrictions had an ambiguous effect on gun-related crimes or deaths," end quote. So this refers back to what I was talking about with how the United States has experienced a drop in gun homicides and crime over the last 20 years, and so has Australia. But even before that, the gun-related crimes were already going down. The actual ban on guns didn't change that number at all. Now, the last thing that I want to point out here is going to be the Civil War point. I think this is incredibly important to point out. Even if we were to ban guns from the United States, even if that was going to have some sort of slight benefit, anyone would agree with my opponent on this, there will be mass revolts. There's going to be a significant increase in homicides, in crime, and in violence, because Americans are not going to just stand by and take the fact that their guns are being taken away. There's no reason to switch to this policy if it leads to more death.
Okay. Once again, addressing some of your points. You say that smuggling is still going to occur because there is an increased incentive, and that also pointing to existing gun control policies. My response to the existing gun control policies is what I was saying earlier, which shows why you need a blanket of interlocking policies that all affect one another, with things like buyback schemes and things like amnesty periods to actually decrease the number of guns that exist. If you just try to institute one policy, there are a million ways around it and a million ways to be able to circumnavigate it. Whereas if you introduce a blanket scheme, those things become harder, right? There is an increased incentive to be able to supply those things, but they now can't do any, because like the very act of just having a gun on their person without the proper paperwork is something that is illegal. So it is much harder to carry guns to a circumstance where you're able to sell them. It is much harder to get them into the country. You can no longer carry them through things like airports, which is the majority of the way that people get into the country. Yes, there is a small increased incentive, but it also becomes much, much harder for the actual smuggling of guns to take place. So I don't think that this point stands. Secondly, you quoted a bunch of statistics there, but you've kind of sort of shifted the yard post on what it is that you're saying. The first thing that the statistics that you quoted there was specifically about gun-related homicides, when earlier you were saying the total number of homicides is something that has stayed stable. The other thing that you say is that you're saying in regards to my self-defense point that there is a number of self-defense that is over the amount of homicides. But what I pointed out, and what the Violence Prevention Center statistics point out, is that because you are more likely to hurt yourself or hurt others, that it's not about comparing self-defense to homicide. It's about comparing self-defense to accidents, which is something that happens far more. I think this year alone, something like 700 children under the age of 11 have died or been injured from accidental gun misfires in the United States. That is just an awful statistic that we should do our bbest to try to get rid of. Let me talk briefly about this Civil War point. I think you're vastly overestimating this kind of thing, right? Like, these are the same people who say who are really staunch gun supporters, who look at groups like Antifa, who use violence as a means of regressing against their government and say, what a bunch of insane lunatics, right? Those people may talk of big game, but when it actually comes down to trying to follow the laws of their society, that is not something that they're going to be willing to stand by. And if there is enough warning period and enough being able to sort of have public debate and being able to justify this to the populace, people are going to get on board and people are going to be willing to give up those things. And if they're not, then they can hold on to them until they come to their senses for the next amnesty period, when they then give them up. Let's talk briefly about safely, while I have a couple of moments left. If you, in the event where you're able to use your gun to defend your family, you are escalating that situation, because now the other assailant also is under the assumption that you have a gun and is more likely to be able to respond in kind. The best way, if you actually care about defending your family, is to try to get that person out of that situation as quickly as possible, not to try to engage them with a gun.
Okay. So the first thing you talked about was guns, smuggling, there can be multiple different government policies that can help to prevent this. My first response is that criminals don't follow laws. This is kind of obvious here. But if we were to catch someone who had an illegal weapon, then sure, we would have more efficiency in taking that gun away from them. Sure. But more importantly, there are so many guns that already we aren't catching them right now. So you can't say that this is simply, like, the whole point is that they have them illegally in the first place, in the same way that murderers aren't following the law about murder, the ones who smuggle guns in. We don't just catch them just because, oh, you're breaking the law right now. You would have to have already caught them. That doesn't make any sense. The second response I'm going to make here is going to be that of a third. Even if we were to say that we were able to get rid of a third of the guns in the United States, which was what the whole goal of Australia's policy, a third of guns in America would bring us down to 200 million guns. Does it really seem like any of these advantages that you're talking about are going to happen if we're down to 200 million guns instead of 300 million guns? That doesn't make any sense, and you're not going to have any advantages or any solvency. Which leads, I'm going to put a double bind here. Either we remove a third of the guns, like Australia did, which has no solvency, or we remove all of the guns, which guarantees civil war. But even if we're removing 100 million guns, that's still probably going to lead to a civil war. So let's come back to this civil war point. You responded by saying that you think I'm massively overestimating this, but that's just not true. Historian Varad Mehta says, quote, when someone says the United States ought to adopt Australia's gun laws as its own, he's really saying the cause of gun control is so important that he is willing to impose these laws even at the cost of violent insurrection. Make no mistake, armed rebellion would be the consequence. Armed men would be dispatched to confiscate guns, they would be met by armed men, and blood would be shed. Australia is a valid example for America only if you are willing for that blood to be spilled in torrents and rivers. To choose Australia is to choose civil war, end quote. I think that's a pretty strong piece of evidence there, which pretty clearly shows up, because this is true. This is what Americans are. Any American knows that there are gun nuts in this country who absolutely will fight to the death to defend their guns. So if you try and get rid of guns, you're actually increasing the likelihood of homicide. The next point I'm going to make is that currently in the United States, we have 300 million guns, and yet we don't see a significant increase in homicides. In fact, as I've pointed out earlier, homicides are going down. They've been cut in half over the last 50 years. So what we're seeing is not even remotely something that needs to be changed when it's getting better. Stick with the current way that's working right now. The last thing that you're talking about is gun-related escalating situations. But this is disproven by the fact that in the current system, they don't escalate. They're used for positive.
All right, let's just deal with some of these points here, because I think that you're fundamentally misunderstanding a couple of things. If you say that, like, regulations don't work because they're laws and criminals don't follow laws, you're not taking into account what I'm saying is that when you make a series of sensible interlocking laws, it's not just that criminals will choose not to follow it. It becomes harder for them to do their activity because otherwise legal activities or things they could pass off as pseudo-legal activities are now illegal. What criminals do in order to be able to smuggle guns in is that they pass off the illegal guns that they are smuggling in as legal guns. When that becomes harder to do because there are much tougher restrictions, every gun must be registered. You must have a valid reason for owning those things. You can't just take 5 handguns into the United States through the airport without getting stopped and questioned. It becomes much harder for them to be able to do that. You talk about only decreasing it by a third and not getting all of the effects that I wanted. It's important to note that it's not just total number of guns going down. It's also what happens to those guns under the new legislation. So as I pointed out, an important part is that you must have a valid reason for owning them, such as hunting or farming. And also we're banning automatic and semi-automatic weapons. So that automatically takes out a huge number of weapons that can do a huge amount of harm. But now these guns, instead of being in easily accessible places, they are now being locked up responsibly, where they are only being used in select circumstances. They are being moved from people's homes into gun shops, where they have to go and engage in these very specific practices in order to be able to use them. So even if you only take down the number of guns by a third, you put them into much safer places where they are much less likely to be misused. And so you do get a substantial amount of benefits. Let's talk once more about this ridiculous idea of there being civil war. Look, you say it's like there's pretty clear evidence. That's an anecdotal statement from one person who reckons that this thing is going to happen, right? There are not going to be armed men coming to people's house saying, give us your guns under threat of death. This is going to be announced. It's going to be rolled out probably over the course of years. There's going to be extensive buyback schemes that people can go and be able to engage with. If people want to hold on to their guns, they can take them to gun clubs and leave them there. They can register to have it as a hunting weapon. There are things that you can do where people who like, if you are committed to owning a gun, and that is the thing that you do not want to happen, you can still do that under this legislation. It is not the kind of thing that is going to lead to civil war, because you are not taking away this fundamental right from people. People are still able to use the guns for the things that they can use them for before. They just must do so now in much stricter ways. Let's just talk about, also you're talking about like the system is currently working because you have seen a decrease in the total amount of homicides. Sure, when compared to previous homicides in years in the US, you may see that going down, but you still have far more homicides than anywhere else in the world, including places where gun control has been rolled out, as I showed you by my opening statistics. The per capita deaths that is suffered in the US is far more than anywhere else in the world as a result of these gun crimes.
First of all, that's completely false what you said about there being far more homicides than other places in the world. That's just not true. The United States has a homicide rate of 4.8, which is relatively in line with the global average. Actually, the global average is 6.2 per 100,000. So the United States is actually better than average. And more than that, the United States, like I pointed out earlier, is also surrounded by high crime nations who bring in that sort of crime, which necessarily inflates the numbers the United States already has. So no, we're not worse off than the rest of the world at all. We do have more gun deaths, but we don't have more overall deaths per rate. So no, you're wrong to point that out at all. You talked about how the reason that smuggling would be prevented is because they can't get things through airports, but that fundamentally misunderstands my point. So my point is going to be Mexican border. The reason that they're able to get in right now is because the United States is bordered by Mexico, which has a very porous border. We can already smuggle 250,000 guns into the United States right now illegally across the Mexican border. That's not airports. That's just getting them across. It's not hard to do. It already happens. It's going to continue, and it's going to be increased if we try and ban guns in the country. It doesn't make sense. You stated that we will be banning things, guns, like Australia did, unless they can be used for hunting or farming. Two responses. First, there are only 2% of deaths that are currently happening with a rifle. The majority of deaths are happening with handguns. So if you're keeping all handguns, you're going to still have 98% of homicides by guns. So you're not changing anything. So that doesn't make any sense. And my second response here is going to be that of self-defense. Self-defense isn't included in hunting or farming. The majority of Americans own guns for the purposes of self-defense, not for hunting or farming. A couple of them own them for hunting or farming. So if you're removing guns that people are currently trying to use for self-defense, you're actually definitely going to increase the rate of likelihood of a civil war or armed conflict. Now let's talk about that civil war or armed conflict point. You say that it's ridiculous because there's not going to be armed men going house to house. Well, my response would be, first of all, American buybacks won't work. Americans aren't looking to give up guns. They're not looking to have this buyback program. If you want to actually get rid of them having these guns, you must enforce it. And if you try and enforce it, that's when you're going to have guaranteed civil war. Or at least revolution of some sort. People are going to be fighting over this. Josh Teal at Unilad says, quote, there is a 99% chance that pilfering of arms in America would first lead to the resignation of thousands of authority figures not willing to enter the homes of obsessed gun owners, and secondly, another civil war. The casualties of this would arguably outnumber the amount of those killed by guns in the last decade, end quote. So what you're pointing out here just doesn't make sense. First of all, guns are being used more often than not for self-defense in America. 500,000 in self-defense versus 12,000 for homicide. More often than not, they're a benefit. Then if we try to take them away for a benefit that, as I will again point out, the benefit in Australia wasn't even proven, and it will lead to civil war. So we're increasing the rate of death. This does not make sense. It hurts everyone.
Okay. Responses to your points and then some closing statements. You say that it's wrong of me to bring up airports because the majority of these guns are coming through the borders. A majority of the way that people transport from Mexico to the United States is through the airports. And so I think it's natural to assume that there is some number of people who are smuggling guns in through that way. If they can no longer do that, and the only mechanism that they have to smuggle guns is through the border, that makes it substantially harder for them to do because they can't obviously cross at border crossings where that are well enforced. So they have to go to smaller, less enforced border crossings and then also try to take through like huge amounts of stuff with them as opposed to just their person. Obviously, that makes it harder. Obviously, that shrinks the amount of guns that are being smuggled in. You still get some benefit. You say that people are not going to be willing to give up their guns because they don't want to give up their guns. They're going to want to give up their guns where the option is still owning a gun or and being a criminal or being able to get some sort of monetary incentive back from that. I agree that there are probably going to be some very obsessed people who are going to hold on to their guns. I think a majority and who are willing to, like, just consider this for a second, right? If you're a person who's like, I want to protect my family, I think the best way to do that is with a handgun. Are you really the type of person who is going to say, I'm going to fight a war against the government in which I am probably going to die and no longer be there for my family just so I can hold on to this handgun? Yeah, maybe there are a small number of crazy people who are willing to do that, but I think the majority of Americans just care about protecting themselves and protecting their family, and if push comes to shove, would have to give it up. I think the Civil War point is vastly overrated and pure speculation. You say once again that it's most likely to be used for self-defense. That is countered directly by the statistic that I keep providing you, that you are more likely to hurt yourself or hurt someone that you love rather than stop an assailant with it. It is blatantly untrue. If you want a good self-defense policy, you should get a good security system, which costs about the same much as a handgun, and you should get a home and contents insurance so that if someone comes to your house looking to hurt you, you can say, dude, take my stuff. I don't care. Just get out of it. Don't hurt my family. If you want to engage in a John Woo style shoot off, you're engaging in a power fantasy. You are not actually trying to do anything to keep you or your family safe. Some closing statements, right? Which I think is really important, is that, like, people in America exist under this kind of cultural assumption that people have guns and that I need to protect myself and that I need to get a gun to be able to do that. And that is the reason why you see so much proliferation. If we are able to turn that back by ensuring that guns are decreased and the number that are still in effect are locked up, then you have that assumption being taken away from people, which is important because it means that you are able, the freedoms that we are able in Australia, where I can walk the street of even dodgy parts of my city at night without the fear that I'm going to get shot. I don't have to worry about those kind of gun violence in my homes, in my communities, or in my schools. That is something that is not currently engaged with by a majority of Americans, in which something that you guys are missing out by not having this gun control policy. I think that is a far more important freedom to fight for. And I think the only way that you're going to be able to do that is to decrease the number of guns and ensure that those are left are put in safe, responsible places where they can't be misused.
So first of all, you talk about the freedom to walk the street. Well, the fact of the matter is, currently, the United States is experiencing a significantly positive reduction in crime and homicide in the country. Fact of the matter, 50% reduction over the last 20 years, same over the last 50 years. We are on the downswing in violence. When you point to all these, oh, you don't have to worry about fear. Yeah, that's why what the United States is currently doing is working, as I pointed out. In fact, we've actually increased the number of guns by 50 million over those last 20 years, and the rate of crime has gone down by 50%. So you're wrong to assume that those two are in any way correlated, when what we actually see is that crime is going down. Americans are currently being benefited by these policies. Next, let's point to the fact that Australia went up in homicides in the years initially following the gun ban, as I pointed out earlier. The United Kingdom also did so. They went up in the homicides in the years initially following the gun ban. So we know if America institutes this gun ban, we will increase our homicides, at least over the first few years, maybe longer. That's before we factor in the problems of Americans revolting, Americans fighting against the government, and here's where we come down to the last argument that you had here, which was very obsessed people, people who want handguns won't revolt, and that you're more likely to hurt someone you love. So the first thing to point out is that I don't think you understand American culture, which is necessarily ingrained in this idea of having the Second Amendment. That's part of what it is to be American. If the government tried to take away guns, Americans would be, to use the phrase, up in arms. They literally would be up in arms over the fact that you're taking away our constitutional rights. That simply is not going to fly, which is why historians and analysts have all pointed out this would lead to civil war. Or even if it doesn't lead to civil war, it would lead to at least some people who will be fighting the government, which is increasing the rates of homicide, people who will get caught in the crossfire, where we're going to increase the amount of deaths, both in the short term, possibly in the long term, and it just doesn't make sense, especially, and this is going to lead to yet another point that I've been pointing out for a while here, Australia didn't experience a net decrease in homicides. This whole thing we're going for doesn't make sense when neither Australia or Britain experienced a total decrease in homicides. So we have an unproven benefit, we have a clear harm, there's no reason to switch to this. Now, the last thing that you're talking about here is it's more likely that we will hurt someone you love. Which I guess you're talking about accidents here. And I think it's fair to say that accidents do occur, but they occur with most weapons. And that's not really a reason to ban guns, especially when we contrast. Once again, let's come back to these important numbers. The important numbers here, even if we include total amounts of accidents, suicides, and murders, that comes out to about 50,000 per year. Contrast this with 500,000 to 3 million times per year guns are being used as a positive in America. There's a clear benefit, no reason to change.
Focused mainly on homicides in your case, which, as I've pointed out, are only a tiny number of the problem when it comes to gun violence. I'm talking about mass shootings, I'm talking about suicides. I can prove benefits for both of those things. And also in regards to homicides, you're only talking about the ones that